for inviting me here this afternoon. I travelled on Friday, leaving Dublin at 10 minutes to 2 and arriving here at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. I'm not much good at sleeping on the plane, and so I gave up and I watched some of the movies that were on offer. One I watched twice, and it was the movie about Nelson Mandela and Francois Pienaar, who worked together around the sport of rugby to pull together contemporary South Africa. Now, whatever we make of the Mandela experiment, it was very interesting to see what he said and how he worked with a white Afrikaner rugby player to move the whole self-understanding of the culture forward and to change the attitude of the South African rugby team to itself and the whole nation to the sport of rugby. Part of the reason I am telling you this story is to connect exactly with what the previous speaker said. Because this happened in the run-up to the 1995 Rugby World Cup. And when Mandela invited the South African rugby captain to come and have afternoon tea with him, he said, "I went to the Barcelona Olympics and I said to myself, I must go home and do better. I must go home and do better." There's no point watching other people winning if you don't actually engage at home and do better. And that then inspired the white captain to do extraordinary things. To take his whole team on a captain's run into the township and to teach boys who knew nothing about rugby to play rugby. He took them on a boat and he brought them to Robben Island and to exactly the cell where Mandela had been and into the yard where Mandela had broken stones, so that they would see there was a connection between the prison and the presidency. But it was the words of Mandela, "I must go home and I must do better," which I thought very much connected with what we've just heard, which is that the local is the place of presence, and therefore the local is the place of mission. And why is that? Because God is absent from nowhere, and everywhere is full of human beings like you and me. So if we are to make an incarnational and a spiritual connection, the most fascinating, the most difficult, and yet the most inspiring place to do it is to do it where we are. But I suppose historically, and I stand here with a genuine apology for this, historically, the way in which people from my part of the world, which is only a part of the world, have understood mission is bringing something to people who don't have what we have. Bringing something to people who don't have what we have. Of course, the ignorance and the shame in the heart of that is that many had no interest in learning what people had already before they arrived. And from that we have learned that mission is a reciprocal learning and a reciprocal experience. I'm fortunate enough to be a member of an Anglican Oriental Orthodox Commission where Father K.M. George is also a member. And I fully understand and fully realize that we have a relationship of theological friendship, but we do not have an intercommunion. So while I worship this morning in a wonderful, vibrant parish church here in this diocese, I would never have expected to have been invited to receive communion. I wasn't invited, and there was no insult. That is just who we are together at this time. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a relationship of intense respect and importance. And to me, that's quite important. I suppose to set the scene, I just want to say a few things about what life is like in my country, what life is like in my part of the world, which is a shrinking part of the world. The population is getting smaller and older. The public impact of the institutional churches is disappearing by the day, and the dangers are not seen by everybody. In a simple-minded way, the first thing I want to say is that if you'll accept my categories, we have the pre-secular, the secular, and the post-secular. Most people are living in a post-secular self-understanding. Most churches are living in a pre-secular understanding. Most policymakers are living in a secular understanding. And so there is a tremendous clash of expectation, because as one of my predecessors in my own job said, when all else fails, God turns to money. Now, that is not an irreverent statement. If you're actually working in partnership with state agencies, you do need to be able to convince them that what you are offering as a church is for a public benefit. It cannot be for your private flourishing, it has to be for a public benefit. And therefore there is this difficulty, particularly around two issues which always have been at the heart of mission as we have understood it, which is the sharing of education and the sharing of healthcare. And these have got to do with beginning and end of life issues. If you want to be really crude about it, you'd be talking about abortion and euthanasia. And they also have to do with the context in which education is delivered. Because we have a system of patronage in education, and religious bodies may be patrons. I am the patron of 200 primary schools and I think 26 secondary schools. The one thing that of course doesn't matter to policymakers in the secular world is what happens in the university, which actually is a place where a lot of people have their life experiences, life-changing experiences, and create formative relationships. So that's the first thing to bear in mind, I think, in my context in relation to mission. The pre-secular, the secular, and the post-secular. The other thing, and both of the previous speakers spoke of them, in relation to mission, my own understanding from an Anglican perspective is that there would be three factors happening all at once. One is the question of your own theological method, which you derive from your own tradition. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. The other would be institutional preconceptions and their limitations. And the third would be suppressed and distorted cultural identity. Now, if I go into the theological method, it's very difficult to be missional in the name of Christ if you haven't got a strong and a settled and a relaxed theological self-understanding. If you're confused, it's very difficult to answer questions straight. And I think in relation to mission, we live very much in a world today where the other person's question has become more important than my answer. I think historically, people like me have been accustomed to providing answers, perhaps, to questions that haven't been asked. And that is not a particularly helpful place to be. It presupposes a gap of ignorance between me and the person asking the question, and increasingly that gap has been closed. So I think that's one thing that's very important for us to remember. The quality of question that is coming towards us, and therefore the first thing is to listen, the second thing is to listen, and the third thing is to respond. And perhaps the fourth thing may be to say, I don't actually know. For somebody who is a perceived expert, to say, I don't know, is actually the most liberating thing for somebody to hear. And that, I think, is where the seminar, the conversation, the discussion can happen. Within our context, we are in many ways exactly as you are. But because we come from the Latin West, perhaps it's expressed in the following way. Lex orandi, lex credendi. The way of praying is the way of believing. You will find what we teach in the ways in which we worship. Lex orandi, the law of praying. Lex credendi, the law of believing. But doctrine is to be found primarily in liturgy. And why is that important? Because the liturgy is wide open as a public place and space to the literate and to the illiterate. Not simply to the theologically literate and theologically illiterate, but to everybody. And so the questions and the responses and the generosities come through the participation in worship and raise and respond to the doctrinal questions. Together with Father K.M. George, we've done quite a lot of work in this commission on the understanding of the second and the third persons of the Trinity. And of course, the work of Cyril of Alexandria has been pivotal and foundational in that. And we were aided in that by the fact that the sadly now deceased Metropolitan Bishoy from the Coptic Orthodox Church was very much an exponent of and an authority on the work of St. Cyril. But one of the things that mercifully and finally we have agreed as an Anglican communion to do away with is the double procession. Who proceedeth from the Father and the Son, who proceedeth from the Father. So there I am this morning, sitting in church. Parallel English text, and I'm reading through what's happening while it's in a language which I don't myself speak. And I see all of this in the Creed. I see lots of other prayers which we use in a different way, but to a missional purpose. So that's what I say, the law of believing is the law of praying. Another thing which is not confined to us, but is an Anglican method of reflection, the use together of Scripture and tradition and reason. Scripture may sound as if it's blindingly obvious. Of course, Scripture is what Scripture says. But actually we know very well that without critical interpretation of Scripture, Scripture is perhaps not saying very much to a contemporary generation. And so one of the great dangers, I think, is a division between Scripture and devotion. The two need to work together. And as part of our devotion, we need to be able to be critical. And if we are excessively critical, we need to be careful for those who are less critical. But devotion and criticism need to work together. Tradition. One of my predecessors in the diocese I was in before I went to Dublin, he had been a professor of theology in the University of Nottingham in England. And he said quite openly, nothing new has happened theologically after the year 500. The real questions were asked in the early days of the life of the church. And it's as much as anything for that reason that within the Anglican tradition, we would describe ourselves as a patristically derived church. We are very, very devoted to the teachings of the early church fathers, and part of our resurgence in the 19th century was the rediscovery of the patristic tradition, and that's part of, I think, what connects us once again with the totality of what we call the Orthodox world. Another part of our theological method would be the idea of nothing in excess. Do not push your own argument too far so that somebody else has no room to make their argument. And one of my predecessors in Dublin put it this way: we need to learn to agree, to disagree agreeably. We need to learn to agree, to disagree agreeably. And I've shared this with a number of people who have been at loggerheads around things. And they'll say, we're very happy with the first two parts, but we can't do the third part. It's agreeing to disagree agreeably is very much an Anglican method. Perhaps you might say there's an eschatology in it. There's always a tomorrow, or you can come back to it, let somebody think about it. I think that's quite important in relation to mission. Because mission, I think, is a combination of care and patience through practicality. Care and patience through practicality. And it's one of those moments where you are observed and seen and you don't realize that it's happening. One of the other things that I'd say, and I'd love to talk at greater length if we had the chance, but the more concerned I become about mission from a Christian perspective, the more important to me is interfaith engagement. I'm not confusing the two things. I'm maybe not even comparing them. But missional questions today, in my context, really ask of me, what is my mature Christian attitude to and response to people of world faiths other than my own? And that's been made a lot easier in Ireland, because we now have people from 220 different nationalities living in a very small country, and living mostly on the east coast of that country. But they have brought with them their faith and their culture as things that are combined. Whereas what we have done is we have separated faith and culture. And the difficulty with that is we are no longer in a position to talk about the things that matter to us in relation to our faith, because we are now talking about things we don't know about, which to my mind is much more dangerous than not knowing what you're talking about at all. And I think to me that's an important distinction again in relation to mission. Because engagement with other people, irrespective of conversion, engagement with other people requires of you that you have a relaxed, conversational, informed understanding of your own faith. And this is why I would go into my second point, which is the limitations of the preconceptions of institutions. I'm not saying there should not be institutions. In fact, I'm saying the opposite. But what I'm saying is that the institutions that we have come to associate with the church are no longer self-explanatory. That's my point. We cannot expect the institutions to do our missional work for us. And I have a simple picture of what a church building is I think a church building is a hearth. You know what I mean by a hearth? A place where you light a fire. Many people speak of the church as being the heart of the community. I'd like to think of the church as the hearth of the community. And so people, they radiate. They go out and they come back. People who are disciples do the mission of the church. And so they raise questions in the minds of other people. Like that story in the scriptures where a man arrives late and he knocks on the door of his friend and he says, "I'm hungry." He said, "Do you not know what time it is?" "Oh, but let me in, I'm hungry." So he takes him in and he actually stokes up the fire and he bakes bread for him because he is his friend. Mission enables us to recognize a friend whom we don't yet know. The great danger, of course, for us in Ireland is that church institutions are now associated not simply with male dominance, but actually with intense child abuse and elder abuse. And that's our problem. You might say, that's a problem for the Roman Catholic Church. I remember when I was a parish priest, somebody said to me, "Things are difficult now for the Roman Catholic Church." And I said, no. They are very difficult, but where one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. Now, it's not just an internal suffering. Other people suffer, because that brings with it an intense lack of confidence and willingness to go into a public space. Because the first question you will be asked is about institutional abuse. That makes life very, very difficult to be missional. Much easier to sit at home, use the remote control, watch a program about religion, rather than go and try and do it. Now, in relation to younger people, I think in our world, people no longer, I don't know if there still is a child, because the word youth gets younger and younger all the time. But I would say a couple of things. In my experience, the youth, or young people, they're fascinated by words. Words and their origin, words and their meaning, words and their versatility. They're also fascinated by ritual, as long as it doesn't exclude them. They really feel comfortable when something is done well, when something is done properly, when something is done with dignity, and then they can ask questions about it. And I think we need to let the Spirit who blows and lives outside the church live and blow with as much effort we put into that as we have put into the Spirit inside the church. And I think that's where we're falling down in relation to mission. We need to be a lot more experimental. But we need to trust to the fact that the hearth is there for healing, for confession, for baptism, for Eucharist, for interpretation of Scripture that is authoritative, and for incorporation into a community of belonging where Jesus Christ is supreme and where Jesus Christ is friend of those who are not there. Our churches have become much, much, much too enclosed. People know one another, they predict one another, they control one another, and they go home. And I think that's one of the things as well. The third thing I'd say is about cultural identity. And a problem that we have, a woman called Grace Davy came up with this question about the understanding of Christianity in Western Europe. As it were, the chronological relationship between believing and belonging. Do I need to believe before I can belong? How can I learn to believe if I don't belong? Why do those who belong not explain to me what they believe? Believing and belonging. And things are moving very much in our context towards an invitation to belong and then learning to believe once you're a member. And this raises profound questions for us around what you might call catechesis, baptism and Eucharist. Questions we haven't even formulated because we're still trying to keep the institutional churches up, not crumbling, and open. Tied with this, I think, there is the current very strong series of questions. Who am I? And who do people say that I am? So it's a question of self-understanding and self-image. Now you might say this is a teenage obsession. I don't think it's any such thing. There are not a lot of people my age are obsessed with what other people think they're like. And so there's a tremendous self-absorption around image, around what sort of impact I make. I'm not encouraging people to be non-entities. I'm actually encouraging people to relax and not be so caught up in what you might call the personal cult of individualism. So I'm not quite sure I've said anything, and I'm not quite sure how much time I have left, but there is a theological text that I would like to, and then I will talk a bit about Packen and Walsh. I'm moving into that, okay? Something that I came upon, which I'd never actually thought of in terms of mission before I read about it in relation to Packen and Walsh, and it's Philippians chapter 2 verses 5 to 11. That whole question of kenosis, self-emptying and being filled afresh. That wonderful hymn of kenosis that there is in 2 Philippians as a sort of route map into understanding who and what and everything mission is. Packen and Walsh, what do I want to say? I suppose I just want to say a few little things because he is also a great inspiration to us for a number of what are to me very important reasons. His father was a bishop in the Church of Ireland, and his father gave a series of sermons in the chapel in Trinity College in Dublin about mission. And out of that there came 2 university or student missions. One to Fujian province in China and one to Chotanagpur here in India. And a little bit, I suppose, like Miriam and Samuel, he dedicated 2 of his sons, one to each of those missions. He ordained them to the diaconate, and one of them went to China and one of them came to India. And so his commitment was there. Packen and Walsh, from what I understand, lived a very full and expanding life in India from the time he arrived until he was 84 years old. And he went through a whole range of changes and developments. And the first time I came to hear of him was when I went a few years back to Bishop Cotton's school in Bangalore to preach at a significant commemoration they had there. Because I understand that Packen and Walsh and the Brotherhood of St. Peter went to that school and kind of held it together. Now, I just want to quote at this point from Packen and Walsh's final sermon when he was in Bangalore. And he spoke about the love and the power of Christ for souls, saving them from sins, perfecting them in holiness. For minds, delivering them from doubt, despondency and sorrow. For bodies, raising them from sickness and delivering them from pain. And to my mind, that is a very, I think, distilled view of what drove the man and what enabled him to keep changing as he lived and worked in India. One of the things that was very important in his self-understanding is that he spent a year living in Durham with Bishop Westcott. Now, we're talking about a time before there were any theological colleges. And what happened is that people who wanted to be ordained went to a university, they did a degree in something that interested them, and then they kind of lived in a household with a bishop. And the bishop had a library, so they read, and then they ate together, and the bishop questioned them, and they went back and they read, and that's how it worked, and then they were ordained. So when he lived with Bishop Westcott, he learned two things in particular. One was to be of no church party, high or low. The other was always to be able to stand over your own convictions. Don't live a second-hand spiritual life. So, no church parties and no second-hand spiritual life. To me, again, that I think is something very important. The third thing I'd say is that in coming to live and work in India, what he was able to do time and again was to do something which is a very precious opportunity and gift. That is to lead and to form and to shape theological colleges around a vision. And he did that in a number of places, and in the middle of that, he became the Bishop of Assam, a diocese that was carved out of the episcopal territory of Calcutta. And so he was able to combine living and teaching and episcopacy and mission all in the one person. Now, how can people do that? I think they can do it because of their own personality and the way in which they respond to the context in which they live and the opportunities that God puts in their path. There are opportunities there on a regular basis, but we're not always able to respond to them. And maybe it's just as well we don't respond to all of them, because they don't all work out. But I think his combination of servant leadership and theological living, combined with the discovery that he had a gift for healing, which became an international gift after he retired, show us a very remarkable, an extremely remarkable personality. And the way in which he described the ashram that he and his wife developed, I think follows through from that final sermon in Bangalore. We hope that our ashram will be a home of healing, where those sick in body, mind and spirit may be brought in quiet waiting into touch with the great healer. Pakenham Walsh was always very clear that his understanding of healing was not in contradiction or contravention of medicine and hospitals. And at the same time, surely we can see through his work that mixture of teaching and healing which brings us back to the person of Christ. And as I said this morning, part of the gift that the people of India not only have given, but continue to give to us in Ireland, is a ministry of healing and a ministry of teaching. Now it's expressed, you must go. Yes. I must let you go, I'll really finish.
Sorry.
No. God bless you as you travel.
Hope to see you.
Yes, indeed.
Somewhere.
Yes. Both. Thank you. The final thing I wanted to say is that the gift that the people of India give to us in Ireland, and there are so many Christians from Kerala who are doing this work. Gift of healing and the gift of teaching. Healing through medicine and nursing. Teaching through information technology. So IT and hospitals and residential and nursing homes today carry that on. And the people known to you who go and live and work in Ireland, they are engaged in what I call the boomerang effect of mission. You know when you throw a boomerang and it comes back to you? They are actually engaged in profoundly missional ways as disciples, and so mission, with its instincts, can travel anywhere and in somewhat ways can come back to its source, enriched by those who have received it. I've probably spoken far too long, and I'm very sorry if I have, but it's only a start. I'll say no more now. I brought a booklet about St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is one of my two cathedrals. You may wonder why there are two Anglican cathedrals in Dublin. I'll tell you why. One was an Augustinian foundation, and the bishop of the day had had enough of the slow pace of movement of working within an Augustinian community and trying to get things done. So he simply went outside the city wall, which was about a distance of 200 or 300 yards, and he built his own cathedral, which was therefore a secular cathedral. So St. Patrick's is that cathedral. But I bring that to you. And also, now I don't know if I have enough, but I've done my best. So you'll have to decide what you can do. These are some bookmarks with a prayer of St. Patrick's breastplate, which is also a hymn that we sing on St. Patrick's Day. So there are some of these, and whoever wants one, please take them.